everyone, and welcome to the latest session in our real-world procurement series of webinars. Today, we'll explore supplier relationship and value management, the 5 program killers, and how to overcome them. My name is Erica. I'm part of the marketing team here at Bravo Solution, and I will be hosting today's webinar. We are joined by our speaker, David Atkinson, founder and managing director of 4 Pillars. Before I hand over to David for this presentation, I want to let you know that we've muted your microphone for the duration of the webinar. Should you have any issues, please let us know via the question window on your consoles. Following the presentation, there will be a live Q&A. Please use the question window to send through your questions at any point during the webinar. And now, I would like to welcome David Atkinson.
Thanks, Erica. Hello, my name is David Atkinson. For those that don't know me, I've been in and around the procurement profession for over 30 years, starting at Black & Decker before leading procurement organizations in the automotive and aerospace sectors, including Rolls-Royce. Since my practitioner days, I've focused on providing consulting advice, training, and coaching to international clients in many different business sectors. And between times, I also lecture to MBA students at the University of Birmingham Business School and occasionally other institutions, all through my business 4 Pillars. My interest in SRM goes back many years, in particular my experiences in aerospace and automotive. What's characteristic about those sectors is that the suppliers are usually, at least ideally, selected very carefully, because switching mid-program is horrifically expensive and sometimes near impossible. Businesses have little option but to work proactively with suppliers to improve performance and value without the threat of being able to resource the business. In these environments, getting the best out of suppliers is not easy, as there's all too often a temptation on the part of the supplier to subtly remind procurement that switching away from them is fraught with difficulty. I've since made SRM an important area of my interest in the procurement field and believe that a pragmatic and systematic approach to it is preferable to a reliance on goodwill with suppliers and the notion of partnering. Anyway, more of this to come. Let me say a few words by way of an introduction to the topic of SRM. Barely a week goes by without yet another story in the press of questionable behavior by supplier managing companies or failures of suppliers to provide goods and services to a standard either set out in the contract or that deemed acceptable by society at large. Supermarkets, defense contractors, building firms, public sector purchasers and providers, and more, all from time to time feature in a rogues gallery of professionals who kind of took their eye off the ball, sometimes but thankfully rarely with catastrophic consequences. Fortunately, there are plenty of CPOs who have learned from experience or the experience of others that supplier relationship management has justifiably emerged as a key component of category management, one that's increasingly recognized as essential if the organization aims to secure the value it's contracted for or seek to gain additional value from working collaboratively with suppliers and providers. Nevertheless, there are many who are still struggling in making good SRM practice stick. Attempts are made only to see that good practice fall away as enthusiasm drops and stakeholder colleagues lose interest and withdraw their support. So, what gets in the way of effective supplier relationship management? Well, there are undoubtedly a number of reasons why some organizations particularly struggle with implementing and embedding SRM, but I think there are 5 major reasons, and I've called these the 5 SRM killers. Firstly, there's the absence of a coherent, joined-up strategy. There are a lot of good ideas being applied, but these could, not always, but sometimes, be described as Me Too applications. For example, following the lead of big names and sectors that have pioneered SRM. This is normal, but what works in one sector may not be successful in another. And one other thing, those pioneers who have experimented, who are really exceptional at SRM, have experimented and honed their SRM practice over many years to create a way of working unique to their circumstance. That's hard to copy. Secondly, we have the challenge of creating a team-working ethos with real commitment from stakeholders and senior executives to allocate time and resources to making SRM work. Experts from non-procurement functions routinely engage with suppliers and providers. We need them to play their part in contract and performance management, and that's going to be a tough ask in many organizations. Thirdly, we don't do SRM just for the fun of it, or even to create harmonious relationships. We do SRM because supplier value is a key component of our success. Numbers matter. We need to get a grip on the tracking of benefits that come from SRM. Value improvement can be achieved in a number of ways, but pre-estimating what's going to be delivered is nevertheless a challenge. What practices work with one supplier won't necessarily work with another, and certainly at the beginning we can't know what's achievable until the SRM work starts. Most people acknowledge that SRM is a slow burn. It takes time to get the benefits, so setting arbitrary targets is unwise. Then there's the method itself. What should CPOs ask their people to actually do? The range of activities one could place under the banner of SRM is rather broad, so it's no surprise that there's little consensus about what represents best practice. But without some agreement on how SRM is to be done, then the likelihood of inconsistent application of the process rises and the predictability of outcomes begins to recede. Finally, the fifth SRM killer is the failure of businesses, customers and suppliers to plan resources effectively. They overpromise and underdeliver. It's not surprising given the lack of an agreed method. It's hard to plan when you're not sure how to do it. All five of these killers contribute to a sense of disappointment and difficulty in making good SRM practice sustained and delivering results. Stakeholders and seniors all too frequently quietly withdraw their support, and procurement's focus returns to sourcing and negotiation. Opportunities to increase value and secure supplier innovation go begging. But what if there was a way to get SRM right? Well, my intention here is to address two key challenges faced by CPOs. How to develop a coherent strategy for SRM, and then how to apply a method that is repeatable and proven to work. So let's start with strategy. Organizations tend to struggle in implementing their strategies. Kaplan Norton, the pioneers of the balanced scorecard, reported that 70% of strategies fail in the execution phase, whilst Bain were even more pessimistic in declaring only 9% of companies achieve what they set out to do. So what makes the difference when it comes to SRM? I'd like to, for a moment, focus on how not to do it. Here are some seemingly good examples. Getting senior executives involved to motivate suppliers, extending payment terms, securing cost transparency, offering supplier awards leading to preferred status, etc. I'm sure you recognize a whole host of these practices, each of which have merit and under particular circumstances deliver, but they don't necessarily add up to a successful SRM implementation. Never mind deliver sustainable and tangible results. So I'd like to suggest a different way of looking at SRM strategy, and dare I say it, a better way. This method builds strategy systematically from firstly an overarching intention or purpose, what the organization is seeking to achieve, then through the consideration of stakeholder needs, financial performance, SRM practice and methods, and finally skills, organizational setup, and system support. The very best organizations, or to be fair, those that have embedded SRM into day-to-day practice, have true clarity when it comes to why and how they're implementing SRM. The key in this method of developing strategy is to focus on systematically identifying the cause and effect connections between each of the levels shown on your screen now. In other words, good strategists don't rush into action before thinking about what is necessary and sufficient to assure success. For example, as much as my own business is in part about delivering SRM training, I wouldn't advocate starting there without a defined method and a strategy that is aligned with the needs of stakeholders. I suspect we're here today on this webinar not because our organizations are already world-class in SRM, but rather we see room for improvement. So my intention is to briefly, in the limited time we have here, discuss each of these levels in turn to help steer listeners into thinking about how they could make that improvement. So starting with the overarching purpose of an SRM program, this is not always so clear. Like many business practices, there are SRM programs out there that lack a clear enough definition of what they're trying to achieve. This risks leaders and stakeholders remaining unconvinced, and confidence can ebb away as CPOs and their team struggle to articulate why investment is being made into SRM in the first place. To break through this logjam, I suggest CPOs should be able to clearly state the purpose of SRM's contribution to the business. So listeners today may be clear in their own mind about why their organizations are practicing SRM, and I hope you are, but pause for a moment and test your intention against this definition. So my proposition or my definition is that SRM is, one, the deliberate pursuit, i.e. it's no accident or guesswork, and two, systematic management, being clear, consistent, and operating with real intent of post-contract value, recognizing SRM is what happens after the contract is awarded. And that's from the organization's key suppliers. You can't do with everyone. You don't have infinite resources. So it all sounds like a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be. If your supplier engagement has echoes of the definition that you see on your screen now, then stick with it. But if your organization's practice is somewhat wide of the mark, then try and identify what's holding you back until they take deliberate action to remove those logjams or roadblocks. Regardless, what's most important is for your SRM program to have real purpose, one meaningful to senior management, key stakeholders and peer groups, and those practitioners charged with leading the day-to-day effort. My recommendation to CPOs is to articulate the purpose of SRM for your organization in a way that makes sense to everyone, but that is also a call to action. Compelling vision and strapline that makes it clear why you're doing it will come in handy when support wavers and stakeholders complain that progress is not as smooth or as rapid as they expected. Let's think about those stakeholders for a moment. These are the people in our organizations that specify what's required. They often get involved in the sourcing decision and are active in interfacing, if not necessarily managing, suppliers once the contracts have been signed. Procurement's relationship with stakeholders cannot always be described as harmonious. Our experience tells us that. Hence the long-standing interest of CPOs in trying to improve their engagement with stakeholder constituencies. So how about thinking about the value SRM brings to those stakeholders? For some, SRM will just be another procurement initiative, something that might get in the way or even slow down their own day job. In these circumstances, suggesting that you're implementing SRM because the boss said so or because a competitor organization has done so is unlikely to generate the sustained enthusiasm and support required to make the program a success. CPOs need to answer the what's in it for me question for every stakeholder constituency in the organization, because they don't all want or would benefit from the same things from an SRM program. For example, finance want numbers, savings or extended payment terms. Operations want a fast and reliable supplier response. Design wants supplier innovation, ideas and engagement with their new products and services pipeline. Marketing wants suppliers to provide something worth spending campaign money on. And quality assurance want compliance and maintenance of standards and specifications. And of course, not forgetting, senior management want the whole SRM enterprise to provide a favorable return on investment. More of that in a moment. The key question will always be, to what extent does SRM demonstrably contribute to the success of each group of stakeholders? How can it make their work easier and better, as well as the organization as a whole? Sustaining SRM is a tricky business. It's made more challenging by the difficulty of isolating SRM interventions with suppliers from the overall sourcing process and the demand for a rapid return on investment from SRM activities. So CPOs need to be acutely aware, and I think most of us are, of the tangible benefits SRM is expected to bring to the organization. Asking the question, what must SRM's financial contribution be to stakeholders and the business, is an important sense check that you're not getting carried away with collaborating just for the sake of it. This is not necessarily only about savings targets. For example, risk is a major factor for most CPOs these days, covering everything from regulation, supply continuity, and reputation management. Then there is the opportunities to secure supplier ideas and innovations, or even marketing contributions from those suppliers and brand value, each of which can impact revenue growth. We mustn't forget that a significant amount of effort is required, not only improving value, but in protecting value, making sure you don't have a leaky bucket. Your best endeavors at SRM can find seemingly good results being overwhelmed by rudimentary failures of late delivery, poor quality service, or unbudgeted for cost escalations. Apart from such disruption to your business, in some cases, corporate reputations can be severely damaged. Older listeners will remember the BA Gate Gourmet fiasco of a few years ago, or more recently several supermarket brands being accused of sharp practices in their management of suppliers. I'll come on to contract and performance management a little later, but they are essential components of any SRM program. But there's more to SRM than just making sure you get what you contracted for. There is, depending on various study estimates, significant increases in value that can be secured from SRM's diligent application. I wouldn't go as far to say there's a consensus on the quantum of improvement that's achievable, but there is sufficient anecdotal evidence in addition to the study estimates shown here to more than suggest that SRM can really make a difference to business performance. I mean, which businesses wouldn't want to improve supplier value by up to 23%? Even the more modest estimates of 2 to 6% would be much welcomed. For example, in my tenure as procurement director at Rolls-Royce, although some years ago, my team delivered over 21% in savings as well as transforming supplier quality and delivery performance, all with minimal resourcing of the business. So what should the CPO offer when challenged to make the ROI case for SRM? Well, my suggestion is for CPOs to develop a tailored and compelling value proposition for each stakeholder group, with numbers if possible. Nevertheless, don't go over the top and promise the earth. In my experience, it's more pragmatic to build steadily with projects of modest size or indeed a phased rollout. One word of caution I would offer is to be careful of imposing top-down targets on the procurement team. Experience tells me that value for money improvements from SRM are emergent. There are so many different types of supplier intervention. You don't know what value is achievable until you begin to mine for it. Once you understand which SRM practices work in your situation, then it'll be progressively easier to pre-estimate future benefits. But at the beginning, it's a bit of a guessing game. So I'd like to shift the emphasis now from the outcomes from SRM, satisfied stakeholders and money, to the inputs. What will actually deliver the benefits? The practice of SRM, in other words, how do you do it? What is the process? A mediocre, half-hearted attempt at implementing SRM will fairly certainly result in the loss of stakeholder involvement and enthusiasm. The numbers won't be achieved, and the CPO's team will be left scratching their heads as to what went wrong. That's why the CPO and his or her organization really need to think about process and the activities within that process that the team must excel at. Leading SRM practitioners are clear about what the day job involves, and they allocate resources and develop talent accordingly. So what might that process look like? Well, time doesn't allow a detailed discussion on the process, but I thought it really important to give listeners a clue about what a systematic and repeatable SRM method might look like. As with everything else here, I'll be happy to take questions at the end or afterwards to suit listeners. The method shown here is in 3 phases. Number 1, SRM program enablers. Number 2, developing the relationship strategy. And phase 3, the actual supplier engagement, implementing the relationship strategy. There are 5 enablers that provide the bedrock of any SRM program. Without these, then CPOs will struggle to embed good, repeatable practice. The first enabler is an SRM program and phased implementation plan. As I intimated earlier, a big bang approach is too ambitious for most organizations. So thinking pragmatically, choices have to be made on how many suppliers will get the intensive SRM treatment and when. The number could be as low as 5 suppliers in the first year before the program builds up a head of steam beyond that. Secondly, and crucially important for the first enabler, is supply-based segmentation. This is about prioritizing your key suppliers to enable you to focus on the ones that are most business critical and or offer the best opportunity to improve value. Then there are the process, systems, tools, and templates. In other words, an agreed method that people understand and can work with. What goes into that toolkit is a topic for another day, but experienced procurement pros will be familiar with many of them. Fourthly, there is the performance indicators and benefits tracking. Although you will be careful not to overpromise, as I've already mentioned, you will want to track progress and ensure everyone involved is focusing on delivering real, tangible improvement. Organizational negotiating competence is not so often discussed as a component of SRM, yet it's important that team members, including non-procurement staff, have at least a basic understanding of negotiation and enough commercial nous to enable them to interface with suppliers, without ever forgetting that the name of the game is securing optimum value for money for the host organization. So those are the enablers. Then we move on to phase 2, which is about developing relationship-specific strategies. Here we identify the stakeholders who are impacted by services and products provided by the specific supplier we're developing strategy for. We might survey those stakeholders to better understand their needs and their experience of the particular supplier, and then some we will ask to join a cross-functional SRM team who will then co-develop the strategy. That cross-functional team is then charged with analyzing all aspects of the relationship, including the category strategy, relationship perception on all sides, dependency and power, past and current performance, the potential for innovation, the scope for improving value, etc. The strategy that emerges will have the beginnings of improvement projects identified, prioritized, and initially planned. It will also define the methods of engagement that then follow. I see supplier engagement as consisting of 3 levels of value management. Number 1 is about protecting value, focusing on contract, risk, and performance management, with getting what you contracted for the primary aim. Level 2 is about value development, and this consists of process improvement, also known as supply development in manufacturing circles. This is about working intensively with the supplier in identifying additional value. And finally, number 3, value transformation, the realm of innovation, revenue growth, and dare I say it, strategic alliances. These genuinely much more strategic relationships may be few in number, but they can transform the organization's business model. And of course, whether value will ever be optimized is a moot point, but nevertheless it is a valid aspiration. Finally, structure, systems, and competence. To excel in applying SRM practices, how must we organize, build skills, and improve? So investing in SRM competence development, train your people. Deloitte's survey of CPOs repeatedly finds that around 57% of them reckon their teams don't have the skills required to practice category management. Within category management, the scope for improving SRM is significant indeed, and probably a lot fewer, or a lot more than the 57% reckon their teams don't have the skills to do it well. So I could say more about organizational design and the application of technology, but my message I hope, is relatively simple here. Seek advice and then ultimately make wise choices. So let's briefly return to those 5 SRM killers. If you broadly follow what's being discussed in this webinar today, then number 1, you should have a joined-up strategy that makes sense to your team and your stakeholders. 2, you will have proactively engaged those stakeholders, understanding their needs, and will have encouraged them to get actively involved. 3, you'll have focused on the measurement of value, and you will trust that a solid application of your SRM methodology will bring results. 4, your SRM process will have been designed for your particular circumstance and the maturity of your organization. People will be clear about what they have to do. And 5, you will have taken a pragmatic approach to allocating resources and those of the supplier, and your progress will be acknowledged, potentially leading to a wide acceptance that SRM isn't just a procurement initiative, but a business-wide competence. Embedding SRM is not an easy journey for most organizations, despite its obvious attractions as a practice. It takes clarity of purpose, a robust joined-up strategy, and the enthusiastic application of a practical method for releasing more value from the organization's most important supplier relationships. Well, today this has necessarily been a rather rapid canter through the twin challenges of SRM strategy and SRM practice methodology. I hope you found this webinar practical, interesting, informative, and that you've mentally benchmarked your current practice as you've been listening. So I'll be happy to take questions now.
Great, thank you, David. Now we've had a handful of questions come through, so let's have a look. How can you justify the investment in SRM?
Well, I think there are 2 ways to do it. And like in any change program, you either look at, you bring up examples of abject failure, where there's been a cost to the organization or indeed cost to the organization of others. So you kind of look at the consequences of doing it badly, or you begin to draw upon experience of others in the upside, the benefits, the business case for achieving incremental value from supplier relationships. So you kind of have to juggle between the bad and the good in the development of a business case.
Great. And another one, appreciate for the ease, this is focused on post-contract suppliers. But what about non-direct contract suppliers, for example, those that could compete for a contract in future or that operate through partner channels?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult or interesting and difficult question, because one of the challenges that every organization faces, and I alluded to this in the discussion of the structure and systems, competence and so on, is this question of how much capacity does the buying organization have to actually make interventions, SRM interventions with suppliers. What's being described here are suppliers who might be at the 2nd or even 3rd tier. So I'm kind of going to swerve that question in a way by saying that you have to be thinking about what are the value drivers in any particular supply chain, and then make judgments as to where can the organization make interventions that have the greatest impact. So for example, in my time in manufacturing industry, some suppliers in the 2nd tier require direct intervention because they weren't performing well enough to support the 1st tier supplier in its endeavors to deliver high quality cost delivery and service performance. So you have to select those 2nd tier supplier interventions very quickly, very carefully, but with bearing in mind how much capacity you have to do that. So a tricky business, but it can be done.
Great. So another one. In my experience, stakeholders think they are supporting the SRM program, but in reality have not changed their relationship with the supplier. After you have buy-in from stakeholders, what would you be what would be your top 5 behaviors you would expect them to show when dealing with the suppliers?
Top 5 behaviors of stakeholders. Well, firstly, one of the things that I mentioned during the presentation was it's so much better if they're actually involved, consulted, and then involved in the development of the relationship strategy, because in doing so they begin to appreciate that not all suppliers are created alike, indeed not all categories are alike. Some are bigger priority in business impact than others, which for us procurement pros we understand perfectly well, but stakeholders sometimes less so. So getting them to understand the relationship very deeply in the complexities goes a long way to getting them to appreciate what behaviors are going to have the most impact. So what would those behaviors be? Well, thinking aloud, well, one is getting aligned behind the strategy and behaving consistently around the nature of the engagement. So if the nature of the engagement is for collaboration, innovation, capture, if suppliers are putting innovative ideas to the stakeholder, then make sure the stakeholder's got the capacity and the interest to make sure that those innovative ideas are actually considered and processed. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, I think the ability to be able to demonstrate that they are in alignment with their colleagues, and so that they can begin to use the negotiation skills of persuasion to get the suppliers to kind of respond with the best and the most enthusiasm that they can, and demonstrate the supplier's commitment to drive performance. And thirdly, I may not get to number 4 and 5, but I'll maybe pause here after 3, is we want these people to show up at the business review meetings, the performance reviews. We want the stakeholders to stay involved, stay active in interest, and recognize that their behavior is going to influence the supplier's kind of confidence or trust in that the host organization, the buying organization, really knows what it's doing. So I hope 3 out of 5 isn't too bad.
Great. And so who should own SRM implementation, business unit or procurement?
I think the overall program should be owned by procurement because we're the experts. We understand all the procurement toolkit far better than the stakeholders. But I think it leads on to a second question as to who should lead the implementation of a specific supplier relationship strategy. And I think that depends on the category. I think if it's a production type environment or repeat purchase type environment, it's very often the management of the supplies is appropriately delegated to the procurement professionals. I think that makes a lot of sense. But if, for example, you're buying IT services from one of the big name providers, global providers, then quite frankly, the idea of having a procurement category manager lead those discussions and lead the management, I think is not the way forward. I think that is much more around somebody from the CIO's office to take the primary lead role in making sure that the supplier performs. So I'm very relaxed as a procurement leader with the notion of giving leadership responsibility away to other people in the organization. I don't think we have to hold on, jealously guard our turf. I much prefer the idea of giving it away. And moreover, and I mentioned this a little bit in the presentation, over my 30 years or more in and around this profession, I kind of come to the conclusion that the job of procurement is not about securing our position in the boardroom. I really am not a huge fan of doing that, although obviously in the boardroom our influence would be increased and we can get the organization to think strategically about procurement. So I'm not saying it's a no-no, but when we think about our role, I see much more these days as one of how can we make other people successful in our organizations? How can we help our marketing departments be more successful? How can we make HR more successful? How can we make operations successful? And how can we make sales successful? Understanding that, or even questioning that, I think enables us as procurement professionals, and then particularly when we think about our SRM, to think about what are the interventions or what are the things that we need to do within the realm of SRM that are going to make our internal customers and stakeholders better at doing their own jobs.
Great. And we're getting so many questions through, so next one.
Hopefully these answers make sense.
Well, to me they have. Do we need to have a clear strategy in selecting the kind of suppliers to be included in SRM? If yes, what if the selected vendors do not cooperate in various aspects of SRM or expect recurrent business from the buyers just because they are included in SRM?
Well, I mentioned supply-based segmentation as a crucial enabler in deploying SRM in any organization, because we don't have infinite resources. We'd love to manage every supplier on the books as intensively as we could, because all of them, I'm sure, have some potential for value improvement. But we have to make choices. And that segmentation requires a process. We have to think about how important are we to the supplier? Because if we're dealing with a global IT provider, to come back to that sector, very often as a buying organization, we'll find that the supplier has more influence and more power in the relationship, more negotiating leverage in the relationship than we do. Because the customer's not always king after all. And then we'll want to be thinking about, well, what is the value potential from each individual supplier? What resources are required? How might we organize ourselves locally, regionally, or geographically to manage the supplier? So that the segmentation process, there are a number of different criteria you can use, and I've worked with models with as low as 7 criteria through to 7, so 5, 7, and 10 is kind of what I've seen best examples of. But there are a number of these segmentation factors that need to be taken into account. So make no mistake, I recognize that just because the buying organization thinks that SRM is a good idea, it doesn't mean to say that it's an easy ride to get suppliers enthused and active participants.
Good, and kind of on similar lines on where you ended, is supplier-enabled innovation an integral part of SRM?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think what we're always trying to do is we're trying to identify the suppliers within the supply chain or our supply network who can genuinely add value to our business and ultimately bring us competitive advantage. So I think the more we can integrate with the suppliers that hit the spot in creativity terms, the more successful we're likely to be. Because, I mean, ideally, we want to be ahead of everybody else. We don't want the suppliers to be nurturing their key account relationships with our competitors and giving them a competitive edge.
And that makes sense. And actually, there's a question just about that. How important is being the customer of choice?
Well, we all like to be the customer of choice. I mean, it's always nice to be the most attractive customer in the supplier's portfolio. But I think the first step is getting everyone to recognize, not least our stakeholders, that suppliers have choices too. And we can't, just because we're the customer, it doesn't mean to say that we're always going to get the best service, the best innovation, best ideas, and so on and so forth. So it's always good to be the supplier of choice, but I like to think I'm quite pragmatic. What I'm interested in always, in my practitioner days, and when I'm working with clients, is around, how do we manage to yield the benefits out of SRM? So being a supplier of choice is but a gateway to getting value. We mustn't lose sight and get seduced by the idea that collaboration is what we're trying to achieve here. Collaboration is a means to an end, and being the customer of choice for a supplier really just gives us that opportunity to work positively with the supplier. Just simply having the desire to be the customer of choice, I think, when it comes to the reality of the real business world, is that sometimes we find that we're not able to get the supplier enthused enough.
And with that, should we de-emphasize the buy-supply dynamics and focus on the collaboration to kind of deliver agreed objectives for both and all parties?
With our most important suppliers, yeah. I think if we've got suppliers that we identify where the collaboration is appropriately defined or identified as the way of releasing more value, and it's not always the case, I'll come back to that in a second, then I think if collaboration is the way, then we should enthusiastically collaborate, and we should bring people into the collaboration process. But we must never forget, and all our experience will tell us that not everything we buy is strategic. Not every relationship we've got is strategic. Some relationships are pretty transactional. And if you look at the Kralich matrix, portfolio analysis terms, most of what we buy is going to be in the transactional or the leverage box. And the prescription when you're working in those boxes is to use market competition to get the best value. So collaboration is kind of very seductive as an idea, but it's not appropriate in all cases.
Makes sense. And how often does SRM need to be evaluated due to introduction to disruption technologies within and with consumer changes? So everything that changes in the market, how often would you reevaluate?
It's perpetual. It's perpetual. I mean, that's kind of a bit of a glib answer, I appreciate, but it's perpetual. If you're on top, if you're a practitioner, an SRM, and you're on top of a particular market sector, and the key suppliers within it, the key suppliers, yours and the other suppliers, you'll be thinking about technological developments and innovation all of the time, and making sure that if there's a sniff that there's going to be some sort of a breakthrough technology coming along, is that you're going to be on the first wave of that.
Sure.
Just to draw the contrast, if you take an arm's length approach to the supply base consistently, and you haven't got your ear to the ground, then you're going to find that you're going to be playing catch-up. So SRM is about engaging consistently.
Absolutely. And is SRM an extension to concept of vendor management, or is it is the term used in the interchangeably?
Yeah, it's interchangeable. Some people call it vendor management. Some people call, I think there is a distinction that some people are very fond of. So let's just be clear. I think vendor management is the same as supplier management or supplier relationship management. Some people like to draw the distinction between supplier performance management and supplier relationship management. I don't, because I think a key component, as I mentioned in the presentation, of supplier relationship management is value protection. And value protection is all about risk management and contract management and performance management, because you can have the sexiest, most elaborate campaign and methodology around using lean and agile, using lots of different techniques to try and release new value. But if you've got all this new value being poured into a leaky bucket, and that leaky bucket is the value is receding because suppliers aren't performing to the basic standard of quality and delivery, then all that good effort has gone to waste.
Yeah.
So anyway, SPM is a key component of SRM in my book.
Right, that makes sense to us.
Good.
How much SRM intervention would you do with multiple suppliers at the same time? For example, supplier days, roundtable sessions, joint problem-solving workshops, and so on.
Well, I'm a big fan. I spend a lot of my time thinking about negotiation and strategic negotiation, and definition of strategic negotiation. I kind of assume that it's negotiation with suppliers where you've got a long-term relationship. So I'm very interested in negotiation. One of the key tools in negotiation is it's called conditioning. So anyone who's been on a negotiation training course at some stage may have come across that term. And what it really means is about setting expectations, being able to persuade, and being able to manage the communication messages come from the organization to make sure suppliers are predisposed to work proactively and positively with you as a preferred customer. Now, if one of the methods of doing that and getting people interested in working together and releasing value to the organization is to get working groups together with multiple suppliers, then I'm all for it. But I think where the rubber hits the road is in the individual relationships. I think as a gateway to SRM, supplier conferences and working groups are very appropriate, but I think at the end of the day, you've got to start working with individual suppliers to begin to lift up those rocks to see where the value might be hidden.
Sure. And then I've got a very long question. So what is your opinion on the distinction between SRM and more traditional procurement teams? Having worked in organizations where there is a combined procurement and supplier management team, and now an organization that has centralized group level procurement team and is now introducing a business unit level supplier management team. Both models seem to have pros and cons. In addition to this, and regardless of the definition between the two functions, do you see it being preferable to have different team members doing the two roles or end-to-end management by individuals? Whew.
Right, okay. It depends on the organization and what is appropriate at the time, but let me tell you what my preference is. And it's kind of ancient history now, but when I joined Rolls-Royce, I found that there were different parts of the procurement and supplier management setup that reported to different managers, and they were in different locations. They were in office blocks that were a mile apart, half a mile apart. And it became very apparent in my early days there that when you think about the workload that people have to deal with, that they were spending 50% of their time arguing between each other in different locations rather than facing off to the supply network. And the solution very quickly became to co-locate people, sitting them next to each other so that they had all the tools and all the knowledge at arm's length within, in a physical sense, in a nest of tables in an open plan office. So my preference is you want to reduce as much as you possibly can the internal communication channels, but in such a way that you can get people to seamlessly engage with each other. To try and maybe answer it slightly differently, just if that didn't make complete sense to everybody, it's similar to the notion of having a strategic category manager and somebody who's more operationally focused. And there's a distinction or an implied hierarchy in that, in the way that there'd be a distinction between a category manager and a supplier manager in the division or at head office and so on and so forth. So I think it's more efficient and indeed more effective to have people working together in the same organization, working seamlessly to a pre-agreed relationship strategy.
Great.
Hopefully that's clear.
And I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions, so I'll move on. When looking to implement Supplier Awards, how can you ensure they are credible and not just seen as another flavor of the month idea?
Most people listening will have no idea that I spend about half of my time working with supplier sales and account management organizations. So I spend a lot of time working with international suppliers facing off to the sort of organizations that us procurement people work for. I can tell you that these people are mostly very cynical and skeptical about the persuasion plays and moves that are made by procurement people. And included in that would be the notion of supplier conferences and the messaging around that, and supplier awards and so on and so forth. I think that sometimes they send the right message. There's an ethos that we want to establish, a reputation we want to establish, and we sometimes say that having a themed conference or a supplier award scheme is a way of reinforcing how we want the supply network to view our organization. And I think there's merit in that. I wouldn't decry it. But I think when we think about how value is kind of achieved through real intensive engagement with suppliers, then I prefer people on both sides to think very systematically about what's really going on, what are the real relationship drivers, because only by doing that can we understand what needs to be done in order to achieve the value. So I kind of put Supplier Awards kind of is a nice little tool, but it doesn't represent a gateway to improving value in itself.
Good. And
I sound like a real cynic, don't I? Maybe it's experience talking.
So what's the timeline for SRM implementation? Few months or years? When do you revisit the SRM development plan?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, how long is a piece of string? Well, the good news is that we're already doing SRM. If you're not doing SRM at the moment, then I don't know why you're on this call, because we're already managing them in terms of performance. We're interfacing them on sometimes a daily basis. Our stakeholders are doing the same. So we're already doing some form of supplier relationship management. What I've been talking about on this webinar was about how to kind of pull all that activity together under a clear, coherent strategy and agreed method of doing it. But how long does it take to get off the ground? Well, I think realistically, it's this balancing act between wanting to deliver tangible results, but at the same time not sort of biting off more than you can chew. So I think realistically, and I mean this is such an arbitrary number, but I could say that within the first year of a revitalized program, you'd maybe thinking about half a dozen, 5 or 6 key suppliers that you'd want to work more intensively with. But very quickly, I'd be thinking about what's coming in wave 2, year 3, and so on. There's a real battle, there's a real challenge, I think, for us procurement folks to be able to convince our senior management colleagues and our stakeholders that, you know, SRM doesn't deliver immediate results. It's not like negotiating a contract and getting benefits within the next few weeks or the next few months. Sometimes we have to start engaging in a very different way, start applying processes and activities that are initially unfamiliar. So it might be 6, 9, even 12 months before we can, hand on heart, kick down the door of the boardroom and say, yes, we've got a result. So it is a bit of a slow burn. So it's not surprising that a lot of people struggle because they try it and then they kind of lose a bit of enthusiasm because the results don't quickly come in.
Right, and I know I said 2 questions, but there's so many of them. So let's take 1 or 2 more. So what about SRM in an industry like oil and gas, where supplier base in current market is continuously changing?
The supply base is continually changing in oil and gas. I do work in oil and gas, and there are still a lot of very important suppliers who hang around for a very long time. So I don't quite recognize, and forgive me as that I'm not steeped in oil and gas, but I don't quite recognize the notion of suppliers, my word, not yours, but constantly changing. So I think it's, I would go back to this issue about segmentation. You would choose to work with suppliers that not only provide the greatest opportunity for value, or indeed where you've got a relationship that you can kind of at least set the agenda on. You'd be looking for suppliers where you're going to be working with them over an extended period. So I think maybe behind the question was the notion is, why would you invest in doing SRM with a supplier you might be getting rid of 6 months from now? And I think that's a very legitimate question.
And I think we've got a little bit of detail there. Due to all the recent mergers was a comment that came in from the same person. Does that change anything in your...
Well, I think if you're in a market where there's merger and acquisition activity, then I think, I'm not saying you go back to the drawing board, but you would resegment your supply base based upon the new supplier portfolio.
Cool. And so what would be your elevator pitch to the CEO that currently sees no value in procurement or SRM to excite him about it?
So I've got to make up an elevator pitch on the spot. My God, that's an ambition. Well, I think I kind of answered that in a different way a little bit earlier. I think you either cite an example where the wheels came off on a very important relationship, or say, did you hear what happened to that organization within our sector that had an abject failure that was all over the front page of the Financial Times? Well, I kind of be drawing that and saying, you know, the best organizations are yielding 21, 23% from their most important supplier relationships. So there's an opportunity here, especially when on average 70% of our cost of goods is in the supply chain. There's an opportunity here to get a grip on that cost and yield a lot more value for our business and make us more successful. And I think maybe the guy got out of the lift, maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 floors before I finished, but there you go.
Well, that's a good one, and thankfully there's a recording of this, so everyone can, if you didn't write that down now, you can take it from the recording when we send it around.
Oh, dear.
Okay, I'll grab the last one here, and I think we have to call it a day at that point. But how important are the values of integrity and trust in delivering successful SRM program? And I think you say quite high. How do you ensure these values are consistently maintained with stakeholders as well as procurement?
Well, for those of you who are procurement anoraks, you might seek out the research on the Working Relations Index by Dr. John Henke in the States, where he's worked for something like about 15 years now in analyzing the supplier relationships that exist between the automotive OEMs and the first tier. And what he's been able to prove, amongst other things, apart from, so for example, OEM or procurement behavior has become consistently better over the years and more aligned regardless of the organization that's doing it. But one of his key findings that I think is particularly compelling is that he believes that if an organization is consistent in its behavior with suppliers, then suppliers will respect that, even if the pressure to reduce prices and improve value is absolutely intense. Suppliers begin to recognize that this is the ticket, the price of the ticket to the game. So you can, as a buying organization, command real respect and trust from suppliers if you and your internal colleagues are clear about what you're trying to do and you behave consistently and predictably. So I like the idea of making sure that everybody gets aligned and everybody stays aligned.
That makes sense. Great. I think we have to call it a day here. Thank you, David, and thank you for answering all those questions, and thank you everyone for sending all those questions. I think it's been a good one.
Thanks for listening in.
And the recording of the presentation, like I said, will be available later this week. We will email it out to you, so not to worry, it will be in your inboxes. And our next webinar in the series, Creating Transparency in Supply Chain to Reduce Risk, is on August 29th. So you've got plenty of time to register if you haven't already. And we hope to see you there. Thank you everyone for joining us.